At the bottom of our planet Earth lies a vast, mysterious region, 5.5 million square miles in extent. This immense area contains over 90% of the world's ice, and we call it Antarctica. Antarctica is truly a continent in grip, we do not know. Indeed, only in recent times has man laid siege to this great white. One of the first to come here was Captain Nathaniel Palmer, a New England sealer. In 1821, Palmer made landfall on Ocean Island. Then pushing southeast, he sailed more than 500 miles along the peninsula that today bears his name. 20 years later, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes commanded the first official United States Navy survey of some 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline. On his staff were trained scientists and observers. From their findings, Wilkes concluded that his expedition had discovered a continent. Explorers from many nations followed. James Ross of Great Britain located a huge triangular ice shelf that cut more than 400 miles into and presented to the sea an unbroken barrier 500 miles long. Then in 1911, another Englishman, Captain Robert Scott, established a base camp at the western end of the Ross Ice Shelf. Soon after, at the other end of the shelf, Roald Amundsen of Norway also made camp. Now the Ross Ice Shelf became the stage for a dramatic race to the South Pole, documented by these rare motion pictures. This is Roald Amundsen. He was the first to start. With his teams of sled dogs, he averaged 15 miles a day across the rugged ice. A few days later, Scott began his trek with a new invention called a tractor. It broke down within the first hour. Then he called on a string of Siberian ponies he'd kept in reserve. But one by one, the ponies gave out. Reduced to man-hauling their supplies, the indomitable party pushed on, aided only by an improvised sail. On December 14, 1911, Amundsen achieved his goal and became the first man to on the South Pole. Without incident or setback, he returned to his base camp, and by January 25th was ready to depart for home. All this while, Scott and his men were quite unaware that their cause was already lost, and they struggled on. Finally, on January 18th, they too reached 90 degrees south, and the sight of the Norwegian flag was a staggering blow. After only 2 days' rest, their food supplies running low, Captain Scott and his party began the long journey home. On March 20th, beset by a raging blizzard, they made camp for the last time. The following spring, their bodies were found, along with Captain Scott's diary. The final entry contained these simple words: "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell." In 1946, a United States Navy task force under the command of Admiral Richard E. Byrd arrived in Antarctic waters. In 3 previous expeditions, Admiral Byrd had made Antarctic history, and now he was to open up even greater areas of this unknown land. When his discoveries were added to all that had gone before, the list of known facts contained some amazing figures. The height of the South Polar Plateau, 10,000 feet. The mountain peaks of Antarctica, more than 14,000 feet. The coldest measured temperatures, 89 degrees below zero, and nearer the pole, perhaps even colder. So far, no 4-footed animals of any kind had been found. There were no trees anywhere, scarcely a blade of grass, only a few patches of moss. There were no insects, not even bacteria. But if much of Antarctica was already known, there was still much more to be learned. And Antarctica never gives up her secrets without a struggle. Down from the pole to the sea march her mighty glaciers. Along the continental rim, they slough off in huge chunks to form the icebergs that float 1,000 miles to the north and become her first line of defense. Through the obstacle course of the icebergs, a canny mariner can always find a way. But closer to her mainland, Antarctica builds a much more formidable barrier. She sends her temperatures down below the freezing point, causing tiny droplets to congeal and dot the surface of the water. The dots grow into fragile discs that thicken, meet, and overlap to form a dense, scaly crust. Layer upon layer, the crust builds up and finally freezes solid into steel-hard pack ice, up to 30 feet thick. But against this immovable mass, man has developed an irresistible weapon, the mighty icebreaker. It was in 1955 that this icebreaker, the USS Glacier, led another expedition to Antarctica. Under the command of Admiral George Dufek, it was by far the largest and most ambitious to date. Known as Operation Deep Freeze, the mission of this Navy task force was to set up on the continent 7 bases to be used by the scientists of the United States. And the reason, the International Geophysical Year. These 7 cities would be scattered. The task force broke up into separate units, consisting of 1 or more cargo ships escorted by an icebreaker. And one of these units immediately faced an insurmountable problem: a stretch of continental ice shelf, 300 miles long and 200 feet high. But this site had been selected for a base, and so the icebreaker attempted to blast out a docking area with gunfire. Like trying to knock down a wall of concrete with BB shot. And so there was no choice but to move on until a more vulnerable spot was found. Then the icebreaker drove itself full power, full weight into the breach. Ramming and slashing, a mooring place was finally carved out, and then the cargo ships moved in. Fortunately, there were other places, notably the historic Ross Ice Shelf, where Antarctica offered the invaders a long, flat sweep of ice, exactly the right height for offloading operations. After several beachheads had been established on the continent, Operation Deep Freeze really began to roll. Altogether, this was a monumental enterprise involving nearly 100 aircraft, icebreakers, tankers, and cargo ships. More than 5,000 men, 1,000 tons of building material, 10 million pounds of food, 5 million gallons of fuel oil, and numberless tons of incidental supplies, snow vehicles, power tools, and scientific equipment. The bases, though widely scattered, were much alike in design and construction. The buildings, in fact, were all constructed of the same prefabricated materials. Thin sandwiches of plywood, spun glass, and aluminum that dovetailed perfectly into place without the use of a single nail or bolt. As each building rose from the barren ice, it became part of a modern city, complete with living quarters, power plants, and science installations. Connecting tunnels of flimsy wood and burlap would turn into sturdy structures when nature's driving snows would cover and protect them. During the first summer, 2 of the 7 cities were constructed and completed simultaneously. They were Little America No. 5, Center of Antarctic Operations, and McMurdo, headquarters for air traffic. But now, almost before it began, the working season was over. As the last brief summer day faded into the long winter night, the temperature dropped, and on the wings of a rising wind, the blizzard struck. Beneath the driving snow, the invaders were safe and secure, enjoying a hard-earned rest. Of course, there was still work to be done, maintenance of facilities, assembling scientific equipment. At all times, the inner man was well fortified. From these subterranean kitchens, a daily ration of 4,000 calories was issued to every man. Through the long night, for everyone, there was radio contact with home, thanks to hundreds of ham radio operators throughout the United States. And in the chapel, for all creeds and all faiths, there was the solace of their religion. The months passed. The long night ebbed away. It was time now to resume the building of the 7 cities. One of the bases would be built on a lonely point of land called Cape Hallett. But Cape Hallett was already occupied by a large colony of Antarctica's first and foremost citizens, the penguins. For countless centuries, the penguins had lived here undisturbed, and then came their day of decision. It began just like any other pleasant midsummer day. The temperature stood at a comfortable 30 degrees, and in keeping with the daily custom, the birds trooped down to a favorite frigid lagoon to disport themselves in a free aquacade. Of course, there was the nonconformist. Fed up with the classical motif, he introduced a seagoing rock and roll, a novelty that soon became contagious. Yes, for the penguins, this was a frosty paradise. But it was also an ideal spot for a science station. In fact, it was the only level place in this sector of Antarctic coastline. Something had to give, the birds or the men. Only an all-out contest could decide the issue. Outnumbered 1,000 to 1, man resorted to infiltration tactics. penguins took a dim view of the intruders and made no attempt to hide their feelings. But cardboard boxes and butterfly nets were weapons they hadn't learned to cope with. After cleaning out a final resistance pocket of fat fledglings, the men succeeded in fencing off a reservation for the base. Removed from their age-old rookeries, many displaced penguins were happily reunited with their families. But there were also pathetic cases of mothers who had lost their chicks, and even more pathetic cases of chicks who had lost their mothers. Some just sat and waited. But others took the initiative, determined to adopt the first mother that came along. Even after a certain order was restored, the penguins just wouldn't stay put. In no time at all, they wended their wobbling way right back to the old homestead. Operation Deep Freeze resigned itself to the inevitable. Science would simply have to take the penguins in stride, even if the penguins strode all over the place. But despite everything, Hallett Base went up in record time to serve the joint interests of the United States, New Zealand, and the penguins. Along with the coastal bases, the master plan also called for science stations to be constructed in the far interior. To reach these remote regions, heavy tractor trains would have to travel through a dangerous crevasse area. Hidden beneath the snow, these gigantic death traps plunged to unknown depths and extended for miles in all directions. As the first step in constructing an overland highway, these canyons and chasms had to be charted and surveyed. For the men of Deep Freeze, there was great personal danger here. Like a mighty slow-motion river, the ice of Antarctica is forever on the move. The explorers tested and even tasted the structure of this tremendous roadblock, for the salt content of the ice was a clue to its chemistry. As soon as the anatomy of a crevasse was known, the demolition crews moved in with a mass barrage of explosives. When the solid walls of each crevasse were laid bare, once again Antarctica's own raw materials, snow and ice, were used to fill and pack the chasm. In this way, a series of solid ridges were formed, and sector by sector, the crevasse area became part of a wide freeway. Another skirmish was won in the Antarctic campaign. At once, word was flashed to Little America. Now the great tractor and sled trains could carry their tremendous payloads to the inland plateaus. Whole cities on the move. And here is Bird Base, one of these cities, an outpost of science, 600 miles inland from Little America. For every step forward, Operation Deep Freeze faced a reckoning, a price paid in costly and often irreplaceable equipment. ships beset in the ice for months at a time. Or disabled, their plated sides caved in by the relentless ice. Helicopters lost when their rotors froze. Huge snowcats trapped in melting potholes on the bay ice and rescued in the barest nick of time. But Antarctica's price for man's invasion came even higher in human life itself. Max Keel, tractor operator, who had plunged into a hidden crevasse. Richard Williams, lost through the ice at McMurdo during unloading operations. Ollie Bartley, claimed by a weak spot in the frozen bay. But the greatest single disaster occurred when a storm developed unexpectedly at the McMurdo airstrip. A Navy P-2V flying in from New Zealand had already passed the point of no return. It had to land, regardless of weather. For everyone at the air control tower, it was a time of intense anxiety. The plane was seen briefly as it approached the landing strip. But now, in spite of all assistance, disaster. It took only moments to reach the plane, for it had crashed on the very edge of the airstrip. Of course, the first concern was for the injured survivors. But there were 4 who did not survive. They were David M. Carey, Marion Marzi, Charles S. Miller, Rayburn A. Hudman. Names that have become a part of Antarctica's heroic legend. In spite of hardship, in spite of tragedy, there could be no thought but to push on. And now at McMurdo, the world's largest ice airfield was being resurfaced and repaired in preparation for a truly historic endeavor. It was planned to establish by airlift a city for science at the very tip of the Earth, exactly on the South Pole itself. Getting the landing field ready for the cargo planes was a problem all its own. There had been a sudden rise in temperature recently, and the airstrip had become pitted with numberless potholes. These had to be filled and packed with snow and ice, then tamped with giant rollers. As a final precaution, the new surface was strength tested with heavily weighted machines. At last, all was in order. The landing field was ready. And now the big Air Force Globemasters were flown in New Zealand. The South Pole operation had begun. The last mountain range was overpassed. Planes were flying over the bleak polar plateau. And then, there it was, the uttermost end of the Earth, the South Pole. Ahead of the cargo planes, a Navy R-4D had already moved in and set down to discharge a work party. A temporary camp was set up. Then overhead, Section 1 of the South Pole airlift zeroed in on the target below. Around the clock, supplies and materials continued to rain from the blue. The tents were replaced with sturdier structures. But the real blockbusters were yet to come. Along with the parachute, some of the cargo was free-dropped from low altitudes. As the city descended from the sky, it rose from the frozen plateau, took form, and was completed in a month's time. To mark mission accomplished through this historic achievement, the men of Deep Freeze erected on the South Pole base a South Pole. There was an official dedication, and to honor the pioneers of the past, the base was named the Amundsen-Scott Base. And so, in the span of 2 short summers, a job was done. Scattered far and wide across Antarctica, all the 7 cities were finished now. Ellsworth, Wilkes, Hallett, Bird Base, Amundsen-Scott, Little America, and McMurdo. 7 cities for science, ready to contribute their all-important part to the International Geophysical Year. And so in the story of Operation Deep Freeze, a chapter ends, and once again the long night closes in. When this night passes, a new chapter will begin, and a new era. In Antarctica, the men of science are already at work, and soon the light of science will probe every corner of this unknown land. It may well reveal that here is the hope of the future world, not only a limitless laboratory of knowledge, but a vast storehouse of natural resources that will serve through unnumbered centuries the ever-increasing needs of humanity.